I'm Tom Miggott from Tom Miggott Photography. At the beginning of the series, I've said that photography is the art of capturing light. But did you know that light is colorful? Well, as a matter of fact, light has a varying amount of red, green and blue. Those three colors are called channel, and they are the base of all the colors, the millions of colors that you can achieve in photography. The color of light depends on this temperature, and we measure the temperature of light using the Kelvin scale. The Kelvin scale is pretty much like the Celsius scale. The difference is on the zero value. The Celsius zero is based on the level at which water freezes, whereas the zero value on the Kelvin scale is the absolute zero. It's equivalent to minus 273 Celsius somehow. And as I said, the color of light depends on its temperature. So whether you're shooting inside using a light bulb or a neon tube as your source light, or you're shooting outside using the sun, or whether there are clouds or no clouds, whether you're shooting in the shade or even using the flash, all those light conditions will affect the colors on your exposure. As a matter of fact, have you ever experienced you take an exposure inside, in your house, in the room, and you look at the result and it's a bit yellowish? And you kind of wonder why, because when you look at a scene yourself, well, there's no yellow. The white is white, the green is green, everything is what it seems, but on the exposure it's slightly different. Well, the reason is that unlike your camera, you have a brain working with your eyes, and your brain has learned what white is and can adapt to light conditions and will try to render colors as much as it can, because as much as it experienced to. So you know that green is green and white is white, and whether the reality is that the white is really white, that's another story, but your brain shows you what you want to see. So, what is white balance? Well, the white balance is somehow a little bit of your brain in the camera. What I mean by this is that it's a setting on your camera that enables you to take an exposure, and by talking to your camera through this setting, you're telling your camera, well, okay, make that exposure, but just be aware, I'm shooting inside, or I'm shooting outside, or I'm using a flash, and your camera will change this preset inside its processor, and when it will take the exposure afterwards and analyze the light information that's been captured by the sensor, it will apply those presets, and it will kind of rectify what you would have seen in this yellowish exposure I've just mentioned. So on your camera you probably noticed some logos for the white balance setting. You would have a light bulb, you would have a flash symbol, or you would have a sun, or you would have a tube representing the fluorescent light, which tend to give you a kind of a bluish greenish light color, or you can have a cloud or a shade. So as you can expect, those symbols are to be used depending on the situation where you are. There is another way to correct the color in your exposure, and that is in post-production. Yes, the beauty of digital photography is that you first have that phase where you take the exposure with your camera, but then you have this second phase where you take that file onto your computer, and using software such as the one that came with your camera, so the most basic one or the most advanced one, such as Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop, for example, Camera Raw, you will be able to change that white balance setting by just moving a slider, and you will move from one side of the light color spectrum to the other, and finding the correct balance for your color through the white. So how did people do before digital photography? Is digital photography responsible for those bad colors in exposure? Well, as a matter of fact, no. The light color has always been, so therefore the effect on whether you're shooting film or shooting digital remains the same. However, in pre-digital time, people would use colored filters that would screw on the front of the lens. So there is another way to correct your white balance, to correct the color of light in your exposure. And this is done by using a white or a gray card. And let's talk about the gray card. A gray card is what we call a gray with 18% of gray. And as a matter of fact, you may remember from the episode of What's in My Bag, I talked to you about my lens cloth. And this is it. This is my lens cloth, and it also acts as a gray card. So how does that work? Well, what you do is, for example, we're shooting right now, and the very first exposure, let's say I'm going to do several exposures of the scene. But the very first one, what I do is I take my subject and I make sure that I have my gray card within the frame. So, for example, like this, right? And I take an exposure of this. Then when I go in post-production, when I go home after shooting, I don't know, 50, 100 pictures of that particular scene with that particular light condition, I go home on the computer and I use this basic program or Lightroom or Photoshop, and you would have a white balance setting, and sometimes you would have a selector like in Lightroom and in Photoshop. Well, you use that selector to target one area of your gray card, and what it will do, it will analyze the color, the difference of that gray in your exposure to what it believes gray color should be, and instantly it will rectify all the colors. So you can go on my blog and you can see exactly what I mean by this process, and you can see the effect it has on the exposure, going from the first exposure, the kind of yellowish one, to the final one with the true colors. In our very next episode, we will be covering the output formats your camera produces, whether it's RAW, JPEG or TIFF. And we will see then how sometimes setting up your white balance on your camera is crucial and gives you a much better result than trying to rely on any post-production tools. You may have noticed lately that I've acquired a new address for my gallery and a new address for my blog, and as a consequence, I have a new email address for you to ask questions. So whether you have questions on this particular episodes or other episodes that I've already published, or even suggest topics you'd like me to cover in future ones, then do not hesitate to contact me at ask@tommigotphotography.com. And until next time, this is Tom Migot saying, if you like it, well, capture it.